ask you to name the first leader of the INA, who would you say it was? And this question is not open to people who've read my book. So my guess is 99.99% of all of you would say, of course, it's Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. And you'd be wrong, because there was another INA that existed before the one that we know all about. And that one was led by a man called Captain Mohan Singh. The reason why I mentioned that is that my book covers some fairly complicated history, and it's the history of the first INA, which collapsed, by the way, because of tensions between the Japanese and the Indians. So now, what is my book all about? The book is about my granduncle. His name was T.P. Kumaran Nair, who was an instructor, a cadet, and then an instructor in a secret spy school in Penang, Malaysia, established by the INA. And for those of you some of you young folks who may not even know what the INA is, in World War II, the accepted notion is that the British, the Americans, and the Soviets were on the good side, and the Japanese, the Italians, and the Germans were on the bad side. But from the point of view of the colonized people, the British weren't necessarily good guys. So 2 million Indian soldiers fought for the British crown. 2 million. So the idea was this: with Japanese help, if an army could be formed that would convince even a small percentage of the 2 million to switch sides, Britain would get knocked out of the war and India would gain independence. So my granduncle was part of the espionage wing of that first INA. So how he got there was, he was an officer in a unit called the Malabar Special Police. He was asked to disperse a group of protesters who were protesting for Indian independence right on Marina Beach in Madras, today's Chennai, right by Presidency College, if you know Madras. And when he got up to the group of protesters, he found out that they were all women, so he refused to carry out the order. They threw him out of the MSP. He went back to Calicut, tried his hands at business. The Great Depression came in and destroyed his business. He was at a loose end. His mother thought he would settle down if he got married. Confirmed bachelor. He says, no, no way. His mother said, okay, you take one look at this woman, and if you say no, I'll never ask you again. And I got this from family, by the way, so I'm not making this up. So apparently he took one look at her and she swept him off his feet. He got married, still restless because the only thing he knows how to do is to lead men in combat and riot situations. Got himself into a lot of trouble. Finally, his brother-in-law gets him a job in Singapore. So he moves to Singapore to earn enough money to bring his wife over. World War II starts, and the Japanese come quickly down the Malayan Peninsula, and now he's behind enemy lines. So while he was in Singapore, he met a man called K.P. Keshava Menon, who was the founder of the Mathrubhumi newspaper. And he was a freedom fighter in his own right. And he was the founder of something called the Indian Independence League, which was the political wing of the INA. So he convinced my granduncle to join the spy school. Now, in the spy school, 34 men were trained, and 20 of them were sent by the Japanese to India without the knowledge of their Indian partners, and possibly having had gotten captured because of a double agent. So my granduncle was sent on a rescue mission, but with very different instructions. The Japanese told him to identify the surviving agents and continue the mission. But the Indians told him, we don't trust these Japanese, go find the surviving agents and hide. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, why that first INA collapsed, because of the trust deficit. So the book is really about his journey from Penang through the jungles of Burma into India. And it is also about his wife Malu waiting for him in India, not knowing if her husband was alive or dead. So I like to tell people the book is an intersection of 3 journeys. One is his own physical journey from India to Malaya and Burma and back. The second, I got my hands on letters he had written, so that allowed me to get into his head. And I saw this man change from a gung-ho officer who would go take one hill and 3 hills behind it to someone who's very reflective about the human condition. It's also about how his wife waited for him, not knowing what had happened to her husband. And the third journey is India's own tumultuous journey to independence with the Quit India movement and World War II and peaceful non-cooperation and so on. So that really is the book. It's that intersection of those three journeys. It's got elements of a spy thriller and so on. It's also got some politics and geopolitics, but a lot of it is a human level examination of what global events way beyond someone's control, how do they affect an ordinary person and his wife, and how did they come out of all of this situation? So that's the book.
So how did you get the motivation to write this?
So when I was a little boy, my father used to tell me stories about this man because to my dad, my late father now, this man was a hero. So he'd tell me a little bits here, a little bits there. And that story kept rattling around in my head. And then one day I actually had an epiphany. I was actually in the shower and I said, hey, this is a story that needs to be told. So that got me going on a pretty long journey to put this book together.
There's a lot of research. And how did you gather all that information? Was it relatively easy?
It was quite a challenge because after I had that epiphany, I said, okay, let me go see what I can find out. And I went on the web and there was nothing. This 80-year-old trail was not only cold, it was frozen, there was permafrost on it, I could find nothing. So I started with family, and as I told you, I got my hands on letters that he had written, and I got a lot of info from the family on what happened to him before he left for Singapore. And through networking, one person introducing me to another, I met people who knew about this Indian Swaraj Institute, incidentally including one of the 34 persons who was trained with him. And I was able to talk to this man and get some information from him and so on. And then I was able to get my hands on British era documents on what they knew about what was going on. It was amazing how much the British knew what was going on behind Japanese lines and about this Indian Swaraj Institute. And there was a double agent, whom they, by the way, awarded a George Cross, which is the second highest award after the Victoria. It'll be like your Mahavir Chakra after the war. So that was in terms of gathering the information. Now, I tend to be a very visual writer, so I live in the US. I traveled several times to India to get a visual reference of all these places. But Singapore, it doesn't make sense to go to modern day Singapore because it's all steel and glass. So what did wartime Singapore look like? What does an air raid sound like? So I spent hours, months perhaps, if you add up all the time, on YouTube, looking at what Singapore may have looked like back then, and what did the surrender to the Japanese look like, and so on. Burma, where a good part of my book is set, was too dangerous for me to travel to. It's even more dangerous now. But Burma hadn't changed much. So since I knew where he had gone, I used Google Earth. I sat in my study in Atlanta and I was able to zoom down and figure out where he had gone. So that's how I gathered all of this info and put it together. It was like putting together an old jigsaw puzzle where many pieces were missing. And interestingly enough, the story that kind of emerged out of the mist was way more fascinating than anything I could have made up or anything that my dad had told me.
There's so much wealth of unearthed history, yet you chose historical fiction. How come?
Well, that's a great question. So I started out thinking of, okay, who am I writing this book for? And the conclusion I came to is I'm writing this book for anyone who likes a good story. I did not want to write a book for scholars and academics. I just wanted to reach people who liked a good story and share the story of the life of my granduncle. So that's one of the things that kind of got me on this path. The second was, it's not just in India, the world over. I think school systems have done a terrible job in the way they teach history. It's rote memorization and this battle and that date and whatever. And it's unfortunate because I believe that history is his story or her story. It's actually our story. So I felt that a storytelling vehicle will be a more effective way of communicating, what had happened. So that's another reason why I chose that vehicle. In as much as, a vessel will change the shape of the water that's inside it, but you don't change the water. The third reason is, when you read a book, it's a very intimate kind of a process. It's you and the characters. And what I wanted to do is to get you to relate to the character and perhaps even identify yourself or someone that you know with a character. Not necessarily in a similar situation, God forbid that there's another war like that, but in a very subliminal and subtle way, perhaps you can relate to how someone, yourself or someone that you know might react to a situation which may be economic or climate related or whatever. All of those things I believe I could more effectively do through the vehicle of fiction as opposed to non-fiction. And in fact, your program uses the word faction. That's not a typo. And that's the genre that I have chosen to write my book. It's fiction, but largely based on fact. And if you get my book, in the back end, there's an author's note section where I have fessed up and I've told you where I made things up, where I've moved things, which characters are real, which characters are fictional. And so that's the process that I followed. Kala.
In fact, it's so true. Some of us who've read the book, and I've read it, probably I'm at it the third time. It's a beautiful story. And I was very struck by the fact that your writing style is so evocative, almost poetic and cinematic. Tell us how that style was chosen by you.
Well, okay, so if I am going to ask of you as a reader to invest time in reading the book, I feel that it is my duty to take you there to a different place in time and to have you see, hear, smell, and experience what my characters are going through. In other words, I want to be as good a guide as I can be in transporting you through time and space. So that is one of the reasons why I use that evocative style. Having said that, if the book is pages and pages of description, I will lose you as a reader. So it's a very interesting balance. I've got to do just enough to get you there, but I also have to keep the story momentum going and make sure that it doesn't stall. Another reason is I grew up not far from here in Ooty. I grew up in a beautiful place. And I tend to be a person who likes things that are beautiful. I like art, I like photography. So a lot of times when you write, part of you becomes the book and part of the book becomes you. So perhaps it's some of that came out as well.
Basically, you're an engineer who worked on the space shuttle and have an Ivy League MBA. That's a pretty analytical background. So where did all this history and writing spring up from?
Well, yeah, so when I was growing up and going to school, I had interests. I liked physics and math, but I also liked language and history. I pursued the physics and math path, and I had a very, very satisfying career in engineering and in management and so on. But this other bug was always there in me, and the reason why I think that bug was planted was because of two very good teachers. The school that I went to was called Breeks Memorial School, and the principal of the school was a Canadian gentleman. His name was Donald Fox. We used to call him Foxy. Now picture a portly man with a red beard, and back then, because it was the principal, he wore a cape, and he taught us history. We were in 5th standard, okay? So he was teaching us about Shivaji. So he was paced down the room saying, Aurangzeb was looking for Shivaji, and then Shivaji came like a bee and stung him here, and then he would swing around and the cape flew, and then Shivaji came and stung him here. Fifth standard, we were rolling with laughter. And to this day, I remember that lesson. And the other thing that he did was, comic books were banned in school, but he allowed us to draw comics about the lesson. 2x3 panels, 3x3 panels. Again, visual, right? And perhaps one other reason why my style tends to be visual. So Mr. Fox planted the history bug, and I had another very good English teacher. His name was Mr. Xavier. He encouraged me to write and also to speak. So really, it's those two teachers, both gone now, God bless their souls. They put these seeds in me.
It's so interesting. Without giving much of the story away, I'd just like to talk about Malu. She's a quiet, unique character, the main protagonist's wife. And so do tell us about her.
So the Malu does not occupy that much of the space in the book, but I've heard back from readers that they really, especially women readers, really connect with her. And going back to my point about wanting you to connect with characters. She's understated, but she's pretty firm in what she does. And so part of what there is in the book, apart from the history and the politics and the adventure and this transformation, there's a more subtle layer. So one of the things that I introduced was kind of a tension between free will and purposeful action and predestination, which is Malu. So it's kind of an almost karmic way of looking at life, whereas Kumar, the hero, is all driven by action. And that tension kind of follows its way all the way through the book. And predestination doesn't mean resignation. It is just that you accept that there are some things that you cannot control. And Kumar, almost all the way towards the end of the book, is the kind of character who tries to change everything. So that's another part of the tension that I have used in the book as well. So Malu really exemplifies that notion of a very quiet but strong way of dealing with life.
Would you like to read us a passage?
Sure. So let me set this up for you. This is Kumar, the protagonist of the book, getting his sister Thangam and her two children, Sulu and Suku, out of Singapore, kind of in the middle of a bombing raid. And Kumar is accompanied by his brother-in-law, who goes by the initials AM, and another brother-in-law called Gopal. The Keppel docks in Singapore, a source of British pride, had controlled the commerce between the Far East and the Indian Ocean. But the round-the-clock bombing had reduced hubris to rubble. Roofless warehouses now gaped at the sky. A dockside crane lay sprawled on its side, its legs twisted in grotesque angles like a giant squashed insect. The funnels of a sunken steamer rose out of the water like pillars supporting the dark clouds of smoldering ash that asphyxiated everyone's lungs. Kumar AM and Gopal linked arms to form a protective ring around Thangam and the children. The melee threw the little band about like driftwood washed ashore. They reached a gate beyond which armed soldiers allowed only passengers to pass. Policemen desperately tried to control the crowd. Kumar steered the group to Royal Navy officers checking boarding permits. A swarm of hands waving pieces of paper besieged the four harried officers. Checking permits against identification was impossible. The officers looked quickly at permits and yelled instructions to the gate sentries about the number of passengers. 2, 4, 3. AM let Kumar's hands go to get the papers from Thangam. He thrust the sweat-soaked permits at a sub-lieutenant. A torn epaulette bearing his rank insignia dangled from his shoulder. The officer looked absently at the permit, jerked his head at a guard, and yelled, 3. AM stuffed the papers back in Thangam's hands as she moved forward with the children. The soldier glanced at the papers and grunted, "Ship 4, there." He pointed at a ship anchored 100 yards away. The ship's name had been hastily painted over in black. There was no time for goodbyes. Thangam met AM's gaze and smiled for a brief second. The crowd swallowed her and the children as it surged toward the ship like a tidal wave of heads. Kumar, AM, and Gopal tried to see the travelers board the ship, but the police quickly shooed them away. The crowd pulled in different directions towards two ships. Thangam kept her eye on the ship's funnel and dragged the children with all her strength towards the vessel. Her carefully pulled tight bun came loose and wavy hair twisted crazily about her shoulders. Sulu used the suitcase in her hand as an instrument to push people away. She ignored hurled curses and helped her mother as much as she could. They were halfway to the ship when the air raid sirens went off. The crowd surged forward as one mass, jammed together with no room to take over. Bombers appeared over the harbor in two giant Vs. Anti-aircraft guns let out deafening bangs. A shudder ran through the crowd at first as frightened screams rang from all directions. After the first few shells, they ignored the guns and pushed relentlessly towards the ships. The bombs fell like hail. Thangam prayed that their ship would not be struck. Oil storage tanks at the end of the harbor exploded into flames. A few bombs fell on warehouses, but they spared steamer number 4 and its dock. The stench of burning petrol descended like a toxic cloud. Sulu coughed and tried to raise her free arm to protect her face. The crush pinned her arm to her side like epoxy. She thought she saw the word "City Off" faintly visible under the black paint smeared over the ship's name. Thangam willed herself to push through to the gangway that was only yards away. "It's close now. Stay close to me. Come on." A little Chinese girl, just a few feet from Thangam, suddenly lost her grip on her mother's hand. She quickly disappeared into the crowd. The panic-stricken mother screamed for help. Thangam caught the woman's haunted eyes. There was nothing that she could do to help. The horde carried Thangam and the children away from the unfortunate woman. She thrust her boarding papers at an officer at the foot of the gangway. He waved her on without looking at the permits.
So it's quite a horrific scene. That sometimes reminds us of what could have happened at Hathras a couple of days ago with 121 people, women and children, who tried to prostrate to that godman and were crushed and killed. So some of the language is very vivid imagery. So we literally relive what happened at that time.
So on the language part, one of the things that I chose to do, one of the things I believe is that the story is more important than the author. So my job is to make your journey to that time and place as easy as possible. So the language that I've used, as you've heard, is relatively simple and it's evocative. And at the end of the day, I'm not there to show you how smart I am. I'm there to take you on this journey.
True. Another question is, the INA was defeated by Britain. Do you think it played a role in our independence?
That's a great question. So what I often like to tell people is the INA failed tactically, but it succeeded strategically. And let me explain what I mean by that. In 1942, the Japanese threw the British out of Malaya and they threw them out of Burma. They came reeling back into India. Had the Japanese pursued the British into India in 1942, it's likely that they could have entered a good part of India, but they didn't because they were busy fighting the Americans. So when they finally attacked India in 1944, by then the British had re-equipped with a lot of American help. There were two horrendous battles in a place called Imphal and another place called Kohima. And the British just crushed the Japanese and came rolling down Burma. And they destroyed the Japanese and they just swatted the INA aside. The INA failed. So then what the British did was they captured the INA soldiers and they put 3 of them on trial. Shahnawaz, Dhillon, and Sehgal, a Hindu, a Sikh, and a Muslim. And they made it an open trial. It wasn't a secret in-camera trial. And what the British wanted to do is to make an example, saying, okay, you rebelled against us, you're never going to do it again. They were tried for treason, which is punishable by death. But that trial ignited the public imagination because with 2-3 decades of peaceful non-cooperation by Gandhiji and others, the country had been wired. It was like a set of dry leaves waiting for a spark. So the entire country rose up in protest, and the British quietly acquitted these 3 men. That was in 1945. In 1946, the Royal Indian Navy revolted. 10,000 sailors and 70 ships in Bombay, in Karachi, and in Madras, they all revolted against their officers. So the British, I believe, lost faith in using the Indian armed forces to control India. I believe they came to a conclusion that they couldn't do what they did in 1857 when the uprising happened. The part of the British East India Company forces that rose up was the Bengal Army. But the British brought the Madras Army and the Bombay Army to put down, and the Pashtuns and the Sikhs to put it down. I think they came to the conclusion that if they wanted to hold India, they couldn't rely on the armed forces again. And I will tell you one other thing. This is hearsay, but what I've read is that Clement Attlee, the Prime Minister who was the PM of Britain when India got independence, when he visited India in 1956, he supposedly had a conversation with Mr. Chakrabarti, who was the acting governor of Bengal. And I've read that he said as much, that one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why Britain decided to leave India was that they couldn't rely on the armed forces anymore. So back to my point about the INA. The INA did not succeed on the battlefield for various reasons. But I believe their strategic objective was achieved by instilling that doubt, that uncertainty in English minds about using the armed forces to keep control over their Indian empire. So they were defeated tactically, but I think they succeeded strategically.
Interesting. Coming back to Kumaran Nair, any recognition or place of recognition in Kerala where he came from?
There is a road. There is a road in Calicut, now Kozhikode, called T.P. Kumaran Nair Road. And it's interesting. I've spoken to people who live on that road. Very few people know why that road is named after him. History tends to move in mysterious ways. And quite interestingly, perhaps symbolically, a new highway has come up where it has completely bypassed the road and there's very little traffic on that road. But yes, there is a road, T.P. Kumaran Nair Road. If you ever go to Calicut, that road is still there. So that really is the only memorial, so to speak, of his fairly extraordinary life.
Good to know. What's next on the anvil?
Well, the feedback that I've gotten on this book is, this is my first book, by the way. But the only thing, thank you. The only thing that I had written previously were memos, at work saying, hey, Bob, get this done by Tuesday. And when Bob didn't get it done by Tuesday, on Wednesday, I'd write a memo to my boss saying, hey, I need a bigger budget next year, right? So, but the feedback that I've gotten from readers and the reviews I've gotten have been very encouraging. So I think I will stay in the genre of unknown, little-known history, kind of told through storytelling. Although last evening I had a very interesting conversation with a gentleman who suggested that maybe one thing I should do is to write a non-fiction version of this book. So I'm certainly going to consider that as well. So that's what I have. But let me. I think we have a little time. Let me share a story with you, because some people, wonder. Look, World War II, the INA, that was a long time ago. Today's India's very large percentage of India's population is under the age of 30, right? Would they even be interested? So I'll tell you of an incident while I was doing research for this book. So there's a part in the book where Kumar gets letters smuggled through a house in Madras, in an area called Vepuri. The address of that house is number 7 Muthu Mudali Street. So a cousin of mine and I decided to go find number 7 Muthu Mudali Street. So we got on his motorbike and landed up in Vepuri. And so we knocked on the very first house. And there was this young woman, I guess she was in her 20s, maybe 30 at the most. She had a sari kind of tucked to the side. She had turmeric on her face. She had a ladle in her hand. Clearly, she was just getting her morning rituals going. So we knocked at the door. She opened the door, and two of us, both of us, had long hair. By the way, I had long hair. So writing a book about unknown history and getting it published by a known publisher, this is what happens. But so we went. We spoke to her. I speak Tamil, so I told her this is why we were there. So she kind of looked at me, and if there are Tamil speakers in the audience, I'll say it in Tamil and I'll translate. She said, "Appadiya, ungale udavi seyyanum, kandipa udavi seyyanum." That means, is that true? We definitely have to help you. This woman spent 3 hours. She abandoned what she was going to do in the house. We took us from house to house to house, 2 perfect strangers. These people invited us in, had us, brought coffee, sent the little boy running around the house saying, "Hey, go look at that house, ask those people." We spent 3 hours with this lady walking up and down Muthu Mudali Street. We couldn't find number 7 because the numbering system had completely changed. Our mission was a failure. But I'll never forget the generosity of that woman. So if anybody says that today's young India doesn't care about what happened all that time ago, I disagree. This lady's, it proves that, yeah.
Very well said. And on that happy note, we are ready for questions. And I believe we are well within the time frame. So anybody who would like to. So we'll probably wrap it up, post-lunch stupor probably, which is fine. I urge all of you to definitely try reading this book. It's available outside, and Vijay would be most happy to sign it in the author's lounge. All the very best, Vijay, and I hope we take it forward at different literature festivals here.
Thank you, Sashikala. Thank you, all of you, for your time and being a great audience. I hope you enjoy the book.
Thank you so much.